Thank you for joining us again on another episode of the Commend Journey podcast. I am your host, Michael Diamond. I am back with a brand new episode for 2025, and we have a wonderful guest with us. Before we get started, I would encourage you to subscribe to the show so you can keep up on what we have going on, and then also subscribe to the show on YouTube so you can watch all of our wonderful videos as well. And so I'm going to in Commend Journey fashion, I'm going to let the guest introduce themselves. So guest, tell us who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. My name is Matt Transue. I am a sales engineer for Commend Americas, focusing on the New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, and Northeast territories. Been with Commend for about a year and a half now, and enjoying my journey as well.
Fabulous. So the topic today we're going to focus on is the utilities or utility market that we end up working with. And I think what I'd like to do is sort of start from the top before we get to the main topic, and maybe just tell us a little bit about your sales engineering work at Commend, sort of your journey as up until now.
Yeah, so it's funny. My journey is maybe a little different than others, and I'll start by going back in my history a little bit. I was primarily a systems engineer for most of my career, more on the technical side than the sales side. Mostly in the video market. Worked for a lot of video surveillance manufacturers, really enjoyed my time there. And fast forward to my stint here at Commend is been really different, yet similar. And I'll explain that in a second. So I'm much more on the sales side of the house now, which has sort of opened my eyes to things that maybe I didn't see and consider before in my technical role. And it's really allowed me to kind of grow my mindset as I'm talking to customers, as I'm engaging in new projects, to consider, again, things outside of the just the technical realm, consider things that maybe I wouldn't have from just the pure technical side. So it's been a really great growth on that side of things. Coming over to the audio side, I'm also seeing a lot of similarities with the video side of things in the past. And it's been, again, a really nice journey for me to move my professional and technical knowledge over to a new facet of the industry. It's been really nice.
So the topic today is utilities. And I wonder if you could give us an example of a utility, perhaps a utility end user or a integrator you've worked with that deals with utilities, and just what some of your experiences with working with them are, and how they differ from other commercial ventures or other industrial ventures for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have, I'm actually engaged in a current project that I'll talk a little bit more about later with one of our integrators that really focuses on the utilities market, and it's sort of their bread and butter. And we're engaging with them to understand not only the end user's requirements, but also their requirements as a dealer of that market. And that may sound a little silly, but there are some key differences between what the end user needs and what the dealer needs from somebody like Commend. And I find that if we approach a new project, an existing project, or just an idea in a fashion of openness to both sides of that, it really helps kind of keep our focus on really what our end goal is. And that is providing that customer with the best Commend solution that they can have.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a key point here that I think that is important to sort of circle back to, which is communication really is the basis of every relationship we have, whether it's making sure that the integrator, the channel partner dealer has the information that they need to be able to deliver to the customer, or if they've asked us to work in part with their customer in those meetings to help deliver that information so that there's a level understanding of what the customer's needs really are and what standards that they need to come to. So it's a huge benefit to all of our dealers and subsequently their customers. And I think that's a really important point when we talk about sort of the next place we go when we talk about utilities, which is NERC SIP. So we'll dive into a little bit of NERC and I will help define some stuff for those of you who might not have heard of those. That's a acronym. We in the technology world basically swim every day in acronyms. That until you understand what they do and what they mean, you might not understand how relevant they are. So NERC, so the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and then SIP, Critical Infrastructure Protection. So the NERC SIP program coordinates NERC's effort to improve the security of the North American power system. So it applies to the United States, it applies to several provinces of Canada, and it also applies in certain spaces down in Mexico. The NERC SIP standards govern critical infrastructure, all entities that materially impact the reliability of the bulk electrical system. So the entire electric system as a whole, all of these standards apply to them. And standards are pretty important because they are different than suggestions that we might make to our dealers. The entities include the owners, the operators, and the users in part of that system. So I'll stop right there and just sort of reiterate that it isn't, just like you were saying earlier, it isn't something that just adheres to or requires the operators or the end users to do something, but it also is something that dealers and integrators need to understand because it's a standard. It's not a suggestion. It's something that they must comply with. And that's pretty important. The standards carry a force of regulation, meaning that they are required by law. All these entities fall under that purview of NERC SIP, and they have to comply with them. So when we talk about that in the utility space, what's important, I think, to remember is that the choice you make in any of those systems that operate on those networks, any of those pieces of hardware need to come into compliance with those standards. And if you are not familiar with the NERC SIP standards, and we won't get a chance to go through every single one of them by any means, but I would highly recommend that you go out and you investigate what they are and make sure that you, if you're a dealer listening to this, can come into compliance with them and make sure that you're delivering those solutions. And then also, of course, get in touch with fine people like Matt Transue who can help engineer those products for you. So I guess when we think about all that, Matt, why should dealers within the utility market care?
Because to me, that's low hanging fruit, to be honest. There is a clear definition of what's needed, it is mandated, and it is something that if they can identify the appropriate end user, they can go after very aggressively. And they can, again, the importance is considering all of the aspects as you approach, let's say, a customer for NERC SIP compliance. But if you consider all of those aspects ahead of time and you go in there in a thoughtful manner, you're good. I mean, to me, again, I think low hanging fruit's the best way to say it. It's there, and we have some products that can help influence their ability to comply with NERC SIP.
Okay, so let's drill down on that for a second. In some of these projects you've worked on, how have the standards, the NERC SIP standards, come into play with projects? Have you seen any sort of changes or alterations to bids or meetings to sort of go over the finer points of some of the stuff that they have to adhere to?
Sure. So because I haven't been with Commend for such a long time, I haven't really been involved in the beginning of some of these projects where maybe they've changed due to NERC SIP requirements and things like that. But as I'm talking to anybody in this market, the NERC SIP discussion does come up. And it's important to consider, and Michael, you said it perfectly earlier, all of your components in this system essentially need to be considered for NERC SIP compliance. That includes any communication systems you're putting in, anything that you're changing. It has to have the appropriate level of compliance for your facility.
Yeah, and so there are threats that come from all sorts of places, external, internal. And I think one of the things that we're seeing now, and as many of these attacks are becoming more and more prevalent and more advertisable, what we're seeing is the requirements continue to be pointed to and say, these are requirements. And I think it's interesting. The one group of people that might not be at all in any way, shape, or form understanding of NERC SIP are likely the people who are going to be at most risk when their utility company or their site does not adhere to them, because the end users, the people getting the power, are going to be the ones without power, without loss, or perhaps the payment system is attacked directly, and then the on-file credit card numbers are suddenly in the wind, up for the highest bidder. And so I think that it's a critical compliance, and it's critical that you talk in the space to those customers, because these guidelines require adherence to cybersecurity, cyber vandalism, any sort of cyber terrorism that would be happening. And so it is a critical issue. It's not just because it's, critical infrastructure is in the name. It's critical to our way of life. And I think a lot of times we take for granted just turning on a light switch and that there will be power.
You're 100% right. I mean, we've heard about attacks on water systems and things, and you don't think about something like that happening, and then it does. And you're like, uh-oh. And obviously that's what NERC-CIP is trying to address, trying to, get ahead of some of those things, and why it's mandated, right? Not optional, hey, do this because it'd be a good idea, right? You got to do this.
It's more than checking a box.
Absolutely. The ripple effect of those types of attacks and the effect they can have are not only widespread, but incredibly detrimental, potentially.
Absolutely.
So if you don't mind, I kind of want to hit on a couple of key focus points of NERC-CIP, if you're okay with that. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I do want to bring up a couple of things that, at least from what I'm seeing in the discussions that we're having, I think are important to note. And to go back on another point you made before, Michael, was very good. As anybody is engaging somebody in this market, don't assume that they understand not just what NERC-CIP is, but that it's required, and that, this is something you really have to think about. Don't assume they understand that, right? It's a good discussion to have. Make sure that everybody's at the same table, so to speak. Anyway, so a couple of key focus points I see for NERC-CIP are things like data integrity. NERC-CIP really likes to focus on that, and that's obviously protecting your sensitive data, making sure that unauthorized access doesn't occur to the system availability. You have to have continuous communication and reliable communication, essentially, right? Across all of your facets. You have to implement redundancy failovers. These are things NERC-CIP is mandating to help prevent exactly what we just talked about, right? Cybersecurity is a huge point with NERC-CIP. Very, very strong on cybersecurity. That's what Commend does, right? We are naturally a great cybersecurity company. So physical security, obviously you touched on that earlier, protecting all of your physical pieces that are there.
Right.
And emergency response is a whole nother side of NERC-CIP that, is important to understand, that can sometimes be an afterthought. Everyone, we like to think about the emergency and maybe mitigating the emergency, but we also have to understand that there's appropriate responses and tactics done when an emergency does happen. Again, we can expand on some of those if you want, but just in my head, I see some of those as really kind of key focus points in some of these discussions that I'm having.
I like to remind people that it's not just the cybersecurity hardware piece, but they also have to deploy systems to monitor those security events. And then they have to implement a comprehensive contingency plan for not if, but when. And so it isn't just going in and saying, oh, we bought this fantastic system and now we're good. It is a rigorous and constant vigilance that is required in this space. And again, we get back to that word again, right? Requirement. It is a standard you must meet. And having come from, in a previous life, having come from part of the industry that worked with payment card data and PCI DSS compliancy, I have seen what happens when businesses do not conform to a standard and then are affected by a hack or affected by a service interruption, and the damage which is done long term, not just to the people who are affected, not just to the physical hardware that potentially are affected, but obviously the overall company brand is affected. I'm sure, and we won't name them here, I'm sure that several of us, either listening in the audience or Matt and I, know a few companies which have been affected by big time hacks. And those stay in people's memories, and that affects your business. And so there's just a ton of ways to look at the need for doing this, but those need to be on the table too.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I mean, the term trust is thrown around a lot, right? It's kind of a buzzword. But if you think about it in how it relates to cybersecurity and just kind of general responsibility in that regard, it's really what you're doing. You're entrusting your compliance in this aspect or whatever it is to a device, to a service, to a vendor, to a product, right? And I think it's important to understand. Anybody that really known Commend knows that cybersecurity is what we're built on, which means to a degree we're built on a level of trust that we have to have with our dealers, our end users, and with ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of that comes down to certifications and all these things that we adhere to. For example, IEC 62443, trust how it's made.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredibly important. NDA and TAA, trust where it's coming from. ISO 27001, trust how it operates. All these things. I know that sounds silly, but if you really start peeling back that onion, you have to have that level of trust as you continue to go down the road. And that's what Commend is built on. And I think what makes us such a really powerful solution for these types of situations.
I agree. I think that we've separated ourselves, and I think that it's intentional. And dealers and end users who are looking for a partner in this journey, to paraphrase, should look at a company which has already built upon a record of being cyber secure and is taking that to a constant state of vigilance. I mean, there's a reason why you can get, as a dealer, you can get a hold of the results of penetration tests that are done on Commend hardware. That stuff's important. It's why we highly recommend that if you're a dealer with us, that you sign up for security notifications. So that way you are notified as soon as we are notified of updates that need to be done. And that's why it's critical to stay updated on both the hardware and the software level. It is a constant state of vigilance, and it is something that all of us can do to make sure that, from manufacturers down. So salespeople like myself aren't, we don't wake up every day with the information that just sort of poured into our ears. We have to go and read and have meetings with manufacturers, with engineers, and understand it. And then it's our part to delineate that information out. And the same thing when for the engineering side of the team, which is when they get into a meeting and they hear from a dealer or an end user, hey, we have this challenge. Okay, well, we can meet that guideline. Here's how we've done it in the past. Let's look at your specific situation and find out how it works for you. It's a total team effort. That's why Commend.
Absolutely. And I'll touch back on a previous point that you made about all the devices, for NERC SIP. It really affects everything. So if we start talking about communication products, and we'll focus on that, Commend has a huge line of products from door stations, master stations, public address, all this stuff. If you build your communication system upon a cyber secure infrastructure, you're going to be compliant by nature using Commend products. And because we have such a breadth of product portfolio, there's a lot that Commend can do in these environments to help with all that compliance while enabling all of the standard things that you would want to do with your intercoms and PA systems as an interconnected system.
Okay, so I think that's about where we'll wrap for this episode of the Commend Journey podcast. I want to thank my partner here, Matt Transue, for coming on the show and sharing his insights with us. We look forward to the continuing conversation around utilities and modernization as the year rolls along. So thank you, everybody, and stay safe out there.